Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, MOS 139 Post-Implementation Update. For those who don't know me, my name is Sam Layton. I am the Regional Airports Manager and Industry Development Manager here at the AAA. Today's webinar will cover journey from commencement through transition of the MOS 139, including resources and support in developing an Aerodrome manual, grandfathered facilities versus non-compliant facilities, advisory circulars, new and planned publications, as well as post-implementation review. Please note that due to today's large audience with over 205 registered attendees, we have asked that all questions were submitted ahead of time. This means that questions cannot be submitted during today's webinar live, and this function has been switched off on your control panel. If you do have a pressing question that you were not able to get through to me in time, please feel free to email me at slayton@airports.asn.au and I will endeavour to get your question answered offline. For all pre-arranged questions, I would like to say thank you to those who sent those through. Kirsten has addressed these throughout her presentation, as well as on her finishing slide. She will go through additional answers to your questions. I'm now pleased to introduce today's presenter, Kirsten Sanford, Senior Standards Officer, Aerodromes and Heliports from CASA. Kirsten Sanford is currently employed with CASA as the Senior Standards Officer for both Aerodromes and Heliports. With previous experience as an aerodrome inspector and significant involvement with the Part 139 PIR implementation project, Kirsten now has a lead role in the implementation of the new CASA Part 139 and Manual of Standards, which came into effect in August 2020. Kirsten comes to CASA with over 5 years experience in a management role at a major airport. I would like to now say thank you to Kirsten and welcome. You will not be able to see Kirsten during today's presentation. However, if you have any other queries, as I said, please feel free to email me those through. Over to you, Kirsten, and thank you so much for your time today.
Yes, thank you, Sam. Can I just confirm that you can see my presentation on your screen?
Yes, Kirsten, we can see your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the introduction, Sam, and good morning, everyone. On behalf of CASA, I would like to thank the AAA for providing CASA with the opportunity to brief you as we transition to the new Part 139 regulations and standards. In acknowledging COVID-19 and the impact on industry, it's most pleasing to see the progress that's already been made by a number of aerodrome operators in developing a new or revising their existing aerodrome manuals to meet the new requirements. I would like to also recognise those of you who have taken the time to review and provide feedback on the draft advisory circulars that CASA has published for consultation. All comments received are carefully considered as they allow for further enhancement of the published guidance material, which benefits all of industry. So thank you. During today's presentation, I will be providing further education on the rules that apply through and post the transition period. Although they're not mandatory to use, I want to ensure that you're all familiar with the resources that CASA has made available to assist you in preparing an aerodrome manual that meets the requirements of the new regulations. As there appears to be ongoing uncertainty that exists within industry, I will provide further clarification as to the grandfathering provision and make clear those facilities that can be grandfathered and the administrative requirements that are essential for a facility to be recognised as grandfathered. I will also provide an update on advisory circulars that have been published, as well as those that have been identified for future release. We will once again be engaging with industry to seek technical input and expertise when we undertake a post-implementation review of Part 139. The Civil Aviation Safety Amendment for the Part 139 regulations and the new Part 139 Manual of Standards had already been made when we all last came together as one group on the Gold Coast back in November of 2019. In July this year, both the Part 139 transitional provisions and consequential amendment regulations which for ease of reference I will refer to as the CATS regulations, and the Part 139 Manual of Standards Amendment Instrument 2020 were made. In addition to amending the commencement date to the 13th of August 2020, the CATS regulations introduced the term Transitional Aerodrome Certificate, a certificate transition period, provisions to allow existing approved certified air-ground radio services to continue under the new regulations, transitional authorisations to enable those authorisations previously issued by CASA to remain in effect for a period, consequential amendments that were also necessary to align other regulations impacted by the changes made to Part 139. I will expand on these as we progress through this presentation. For ease of reference, CASA has published a consolidated version of the Part 139 MOS, which contains the Transitional MOS provisions and amendments. This version is titled Part 139 Aerodrome's Manual of Standards 2019 as amended, and it is available on the Federal Register of Legislation website via the link shown here. I encourage you, if you haven't already, to refer to this revision. All aerodromes that were either certified or registered immediately prior to the 13th of August 2020 are now operating under a Transitional Aerodrome Certificate, and they will continue to do so provided the aerodrome operator submits to CASA a new or a revised aerodrome manual in which all matters required by the new regulations are present. The manual must be received by 13th of May 2021 for certified aerodromes, and for registered aerodromes by the 13th of May 2022. CASA encourages aerodrome operators to submit their manual as soon as it's been suitably prepared. Whilst there is no time limit for CASA review, assessment of the manuals will be a priority. The transitional provisions also allow CASA to continue to assess, under the old regulations and standards, valid applications that were received either for certification or registration prior to the 13th of August 2020. Should these applications be successful, these aerodromes will also be operating under a Transitional Aerodrome Certificate, and the operator will need to comply with the timeframes for submission of a new or a revised aerodrome manual. Operating under a Transitional Aerodrome Certificate requires an aerodrome operator to comply with all provisions of the new Part 139 regulations and standards, unless transitional arrangements are in place. In summary, this means that those aerodromes that were previously certified are to comply with the old regulations for aerodrome manuals. That said, however, if there is an inconsistency between the existing manual and the operating requirements in the new regulations, the aerodrome operator should seek to operate their aerodrome in accordance with the new regulations and amend their existing aerodrome manual. The requirement to notify CASA in writing within 30 days of the change being made still applies during the transition period. For those aerodromes that had conditions attached to their original aerodrome certificate, under the transitional provisions, those conditions continue to apply throughout the transition period. If a new or revised aerodrome manual has not been submitted to CASA by the due date, the transition period will end, meaning that the Transitional Aerodrome Certificate will cease to be in effect and the aerodrome will no longer be considered certified. Provided a new or revised aerodrome manual that meets the new requirements is submitted to CASA by the due date, the Transitional Aerodrome Certificate will continue to remain in effect while CASA assesses the manual. If all required elements are present, a new aerodrome certificate will be issued, at which point the transition period will end and the Transitional Aerodrome Certificate will cease to have effect. In the event an aerodrome manual was received by the due date and CASA refuses to grant a new aerodrome certificate, the aerodrome operator may apply for a review of the decision by the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. An application to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal generally must be made within 28 days after being notified of the decision not to grant the certificate. A Transitional Aerodrome Certificate could also be subject of suspension or cancellation if it is found that the aerodrome operator is not operating or maintaining their aerodrome safely. The provision of a terminal instrument flight procedure requires an aerodrome to be certified. Subsequently, an operator that fails to transition to the new rules will have all published terminal instrument flight procedures for their aerodrome cancelled or withdrawn. This means that pilots will no longer be able to benefit from the operational advantages that these procedures provide in terms of lower operating minima and use in conditions of reduced visibility, etc. An aerodrome that ceases to be certified will also lose the entitlement to grandfather existing aerodrome facilities, which under the new rules also includes the OLS of an existing runway to a previous recognised standard. This means that should the operator seek to recertify their aerodrome sometime in the future, then all of those aerodrome's facilities and the OLS for each runway at the aerodrome will need to meet all aspects of the new standards. For those aerodromes that provide a CAGRAS, the CATS regulations enable existing CAGRAS and CAGRA approvals to continue until expiry. Should these approvals have been subject to conditions, then those conditions also remain in effect. The transitional provisions also allowed applicants of applications that were in progress prior to the new rules coming into effect and where CASA had yet to complete an assessment to comply with the new qualification requirements. For information purposes, the 10-year air traffic controller or flight service officer recency requirement has been removed, and other ATC qualifications are now accepted, such as ICAO and defence, etc. CAR 129 MET observer approvals are no longer required, and BOM certificates are now recognised. The CATS regulations allow existing approvals, authorisations and exemptions to continue until their expiry, and any conditions imposed will continue to apply. Enduring approvals will sunset on the 31st of December 2021 or earlier if repealed. Aerodrome certificates, CAGRAS and CAGRA approvals are obviously excluded. There have been a number of inquiries regarding approved persons which existed under the old regulations. Effective 13th of August 2020, the requirement for aerodrome safety inspections at registered aerodromes, as well as applications for registration of an aerodrome, both ceased to exist. Written statements that were provided by approved persons as part of an application for registration that were received before the 13th of August 2020 will still be considered. Amendment of the Part 139 regulations required a number of changes to be made to other regulations as I've identified here. Primarily, these changes included references to licensed aerodromes being replaced with certified and references to registered aerodromes being removed. Due to the frequency with which I field questions, I want to take the opportunity to revisit the criteria or the management systems that required at each aerodrome. The management systems are subject to a scalable certification framework, are shown here on this slide, and I will expand on each of these in the coming slides. Firstly, to address the triggers. With the exception of a wildlife hazard management plan that also has a risk element for consideration, there are 3 primary triggers that determine what management systems are required to be implemented at your aerodrome. Only international aerodromes, as designated by the Minister for Infrastructure and Transport, that have scheduled flights are required to adhere to the Scheduled International Air Transport Operations trigger. This excludes those international aerodromes designated as an alternate, restricted use, or non-scheduled. Air transport passenger numbers refer only to air transport passenger numbers that are collated by the Bureau of Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Economics, commonly referred to as BITRA, and which are published on the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communications website. Reporting of these figures is limited to international, domestic, and some general aviation activity. But if the department does not publish air transport passenger numbers for your aerodrome, then this trigger will not apply. The third trigger is aircraft movements. As each aerodrome operator is responsible for compliance with the CASARs and the Part 139 MOS, it is expected that all operators will have an awareness of the aircraft movements occurring at their aerodrome. When calculating movement numbers, each aircraft that arrives at and departs from your aerodrome will represent 2 movements. Air transport passenger and aircraft movement numbers are considered over a financial year. Under the Part 139 regulations, CASA can request aircraft movement data from aerodrome operators or from air traffic control. When requested, the data is required to be provided within 30 days of the request. All aerodromes will require either an aerodrome technical inspection or an aerodrome manual validation. An aerodrome technical inspection has been split into 2 categories. At an aerodrome that has 50,000 or more air transport passengers or 100,000 or more aircraft movements in a financial year, then all elements of the technical inspection are required to be completed at intervals not exceeding 12 months. Where a technical inspection is required at lower volume aerodromes, those aerodromes that have 10,000 or more but less than 50,000 air transport passengers, or 20,000 or more but less than 100,000 aircraft movements, then all elements need to be inspected during the first technical inspection, after which the operator can elect to defer only the pavement and electrical elements to intervals not exceeding 24 months. All remaining aerodromes that do not reach the trigger criteria for a technical inspection are required to complete an aerodrome manual validation. An aerodrome will require a wildlife hazard management plan if the aerodrome in a financial year has 50,000 or more air transport passengers or 100,000 or more aircraft movements. An aerodrome operator who does not reach the trigger criteria may, in the interests of aviation safety, be directed in writing by CASA to prepare and implement a wildlife hazard management plan. Alternatively, the operator of an aerodrome that does not have scheduled international air transport operations and who can demonstrate they have a low wildlife hazard risk may seek relief from establishing a wildlife hazard management plan, even though they meet or exceed the triggers. Written approval from CASA is required. An aerodrome operator will be required to develop and implement an SMS where their aerodrome has 50,000 or more air transport passengers or 100,000 or more aircraft movements. A full SMS that meets the requirements of ICAO Annex 19 Appendix 2 must be implemented at an aerodrome that has scheduled international air transport operations. Where an SMS is not required, an aerodrome that has 25,000 or more air transport passengers or 20,000 or more aircraft movements must have a risk management plan. All aerodromes will require either an aerodrome emergency plan or emergency procedures that are embedded in the local emergency plan, which is administered under the applicable state or territory emergency arrangements. An AEP is required at those aerodromes that have 50,000 or more air transport passengers, 100,000 or more aircraft movements, or have scheduled international air transport operations. An aerodrome emergency committee is now only required at an aerodrome that has 350,000 or more air transport passengers or scheduled international air transport operations. Aerodromes that were certified immediately before commencement of the new rules are expected to retain their existing management systems where appropriate and to update them to comply with any new requirements. An applicant seeking to certify a new aerodrome will need to develop and implement the required management systems within the timeframes that are provided in the Part 139 MOS once the trigger criteria has been reached. In the event an existing certified aerodrome is considering upgrading their aerodrome to accommodate scheduled international air transport operations, then the aerodrome operator will be required to establish an AEC and to develop and implement an AEP before permitting the first scheduled international operation to occur at their aerodrome. The Transitional MOS provisions introduced a deferred timeframe for implementation of management systems for those aerodromes that were registered. Furthermore, the passenger and aircraft movement numbers are not required to be applied retrospectively. This means that when determining the air transport passenger or aircraft movement rates at their aerodrome, the financial year period 1 July 2020 to 30 June 2021 is to be first used. A registered aerodrome that was required under the old rules to conduct an aerodrome safety inspection in the preceding 12-month period prior to the commencement of the new rules, should they meet the applicable trigger criteria, then they are required to complete a technical inspection no later than 13th of November 2021. With the only other exception being an aerodrome manual validation, all other management systems that are applicable based on the trigger criteria are to be implemented no later than 13th of November 2022. A manual validation, however, must be completed within 12 months of the aerodrome certificate being issued, and then at intervals not exceeding 12 months thereafter. As a reminder for all aerodromes, irrespective of the transitional provisions, as an aeronautical data originator under Part 175 of the CASAs, there is still a requirement to check the currency and accuracy of published aerodrome information annually. All aerodrome operators are required to retain evidence to demonstrate that an annual review of published information has continued to occur throughout the transition period. Unlike registered aerodromes, the MOS transitional provisions only provide a deferred timeframe for an existing certified aerodrome that is required to prepare and implement a full SMS aligned with ICAO Annex 19, being no later than 13th of November 2021. For those not already aware, these editorial amendments to the Part 139 MOS have been made. Whilst many aerodromes are already familiar, as this is a brand new requirement for registered aerodromes, CASA has published an advisory circular that explains the fundamental requirements in developing and maintaining an aerodrome manual to support the safe use, operation and maintenance of the aerodrome. The AC is available on our website. To assist operators in developing their manual, CASA has also published an aerodrome manual Word template and a guide that provides clear references to the legislative requirements and, where possible, example procedures. Often more than one example procedure has been provided to represent the varying complexities between aerodromes and the scalable certification requirements. Where procedures are prescriptive, obviously there's a limited opportunity to deviate. However, other example procedures will require tailoring to reflect the uniqueness of the aerodrome's facility and the operation. Both the sample manual and guide are available on our website. Consistent with the sample manual, the Manual Authoring Assessment Tool, the MAT, is a free online program that contains the same preloaded text and guidance material as contained in the sample manual Word document and guide. To obtain a login to develop a manual using MAT, the aerodrome operator is to register via the CASA website. And CASA will provide an online training program, which will take approximately 1 hour for you to complete. Any aerodrome operator who adopts any of the content provided in the examples are to ensure that they can demonstrate they are operating in accordance with those procedures. Whilst CASA has provided these resources to assist, an aerodrome operator can also elect to revise their existing aerodrome manuals or to create a new manual that will best suit their own requirements. CASA has developed an assessment worksheet for use by the aerodrome inspectors as a means to ensure consistency across the regions during the assessment process. CASA proposes to make this worksheet available for industry once the worksheet has been reviewed and tested. Access to the manual assessment worksheet will not only allow you to understand what CASA will be looking for in your aerodrome manual, but it will also provide you the opportunity to assess your own manual to verify all required elements are present prior to you submitting your manual to CASA. Prior to transitioning to the new rules, all existing aerodrome facilities should have either been compliant with version 114 of the old MOS, grandfathered to a previous standard, or for non-compliant facilities, subject of a CASA instrument. The old rules also required certified aerodromes to record grandfathered facilities in their aerodrome manual. Likewise, registered aerodromes were obligated to maintain a record of grandfathered facilities in an appropriate manual. In transitioning to the new rules, an aerodrome operator should therefore only need to identify where there has been a change in facility standard and record those facilities that complied with the previous standard. A facility that is grandfathered is not considered a non-compliant facility. Unlike the previous standard, the grandfathering provision extends beyond an aerodrome facility, as the OLS of an existing runway can now also be grandfathered. For a facility, though, to be legally recognised as being grandfathered, an administrative record in the aerodrome manual is required to be maintained. The aerodrome operator must identify each grandfathered facility and include a description as to how that facility does not comply with the new standards. The recording requirements are less onerous than that previously. The transitional MOS provisions enable those facilities that had been designed to the old regulations and standards and which were already under construction to be recognised under the grandfathering provisions as well, provided the construction is completed before 13th of November 2021. Likewise, where an aerodrome operator had already sought building development approval or funding approval, those facilities may also be continued to be grandfathered, provided their construction commences before 13 November 2021 and is complete before 13th November 2022. To address those questions that were submitted and relate to the inability to upgrade existing aerodrome facilities to the new facility standards due to the presence of other infrastructure or land constraints, those operators can apply to CASA for an approval. This will require the submission of a safety case, which provides a risk-based analysis of the site-specific situation and includes reasoning as to why the applicable standard cannot be met. CASA has recently published an advisory circular on the process to seek an approval, inclusive of guidance on developing a safety case in support of the application. Twelve new ACs have been published. An additional 2 draft ACs were recently made available for industry consultation. The ATI manual validation AC is currently progressing through our workflow system and will be published imminently. The AC for commissioning of aerodrome lighting systems is in the final stages of internal review. The remaining 20 ACs that we have identified for development, drafting of those has commenced, and they will be progressively published as the drafting is complete. Whilst I've addressed a number of questions throughout the content in the in the presentation that were provided by close of business last Friday I will provide a quick summary to address those matters that have yet to cover. I acknowledge there is no guidance provided in the MOS on the font to be used for mandatory instruction markings. The markings should conform in style and proportion to that which is shown in figure 8.69. I have added this to our issues register to correct in the next revision. With regard to lit runway crosses, which is a new standard that we have introduced, the intent of lit crosses is to show from a very long distance away that the runway is not available. For this reason, they have not been made available for use on a partial runway closure. In relation to section 8.107, which is marking of unserviceable runways, it provides 4 different scenarios where unserviceability markers are not required. Section 3 refers to full-length runways, and Section 4 does not. The inclusion of the reference to displaced threshold in Section 4 is appropriate. For the purposes of serviceability inspections, an air transport movement refers to the landing and takeoff of a passenger or cargo transport operation that's conducted for hire or reward. Aerial work as defined in section 2061A of the Civil Aviation Regulations are excluded. In response to the reported discrepancy between Part 139 and Part 173, the Part 173 MOS is designed for the old Part 139 MOS runway and runway strip requirements. Part 173 is undergoing a PIR, and these requirements are being reviewed. As with any major, before I go on, there were a couple of other comments that were submitted post-close of business Friday that I have yet to address due to the public holiday on Monday and the difficulty in accessing or gaining access to the presentation yesterday. So for those operators who have submitted the questions, I will respond to those via email. As with any major rewrite of a piece of legislation, with the MOS being 467 pages, it is possible that things are not perfect or don't work as intended. Issues may arise that warrant further review to ensure the right safety outcomes are being achieved. Additionally, ICAO releases amendments to Annex 14, Volume 1 on a 3-year cycle. Therefore, these amendments need to be reviewed in terms of incorporating into the MOS. We are therefore proposing to have a review of the new MOS towards the end of the transition period in November 2022. However, in the interim, please continue to provide your feedback either to the AAA or through our aerodromes_regs mailbox at CASA. I hope that comes to the end of my presentation. And as Sam alluded to at the beginning of the presentation, please email through any further queries that you have. But I hope that's provided you with a bit of an informative view of progress from here through the transition and to commence under your new Aerodrome manuals. Thank you.
Kirsten, thank you so much for that very valuable and informative presentation. As with all webinars, they take a long time to put together, and we do thank you on behalf of ourselves and our members for taking the time to really put together a very valuable presentation, as well as taking the time out of your extremely busy schedule to come and present for us. For our members, today's webinar recording will be available in Airport Alert and emailed to everybody who registered directly once available. I encourage you to provide feedback on any other topics you would like to see throughout our webinar series. You can provide this feedback at events@airports.asn.au. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of our 205 registered members today. And I think we had around about 160 people join us today. So thank you very much. The MOS 139 continues to be a very hot topic in industry, and the continued collaboration between CASA, the AAA, and broader industry is clearly of value to everybody. The next webinars the AAA will be hosting will be during Airport Safety Week, which is October the 19th to the 23rd. We will be having airport technology concepts to improve the passenger experience. On Wednesday the 21st, we'll be having a safety awareness, prevention and response webinar. And Thursday the 22nd, we'll be having safety management systems, which will also be presented by CASA. That safety management systems webinar is sure to be quite popular as well, given several airports will be needing those for the first time. In addition to that, further details and registrations for these webinars will be available shortly. So we would like to give I guess a bit of a short rundown of this year's Airport Safety Week. As mentioned, October 19th to 23rd, the overarching theme is airports. We are in this together. While we are not having, I guess, a big celebration this year for Airport Safety Week, we do think it is still important to highlight the continued excellent safety record of Australian airports, even through a COVID-19 pandemic. But obviously, you know, do that in a more low-key way to show respect to our members who are, I guess, doing it tough out there in industry. Please enjoy the remainder of your afternoon and week. Stay safe, everyone. And as Kirsten and I both said throughout the presentation, if you have any pressing questions, please feel free to email me at slayton@airports.asn.au, and I will endeavour to get those questions answered for you. Thank you very much once again to Kirsten and the continued collaboration with CASA. It's very much appreciated. Have a good afternoon.